Welcome back to 2.5 Hours. I'm Brian Becker. We're in our Washington, D.C. studio discussing the 2012 elections, the role of money and the role of power in the selection of the candidates and in the final outcome in November. We're joined by Seton Motley. He's a director, I guess, or president of Less Government. Sam Hussein with VoterPact.org. Michael Fauntroy, a professor at George Mason University. And Eugene Puryear, Party for Socialism and Liberation, the campaign manager for the Lindsay Osario 2012 independent political campaign. Seton Motley, let's start with you. We're in the middle of the Republican primaries. We also are witnessing the influence of the super PACs. That is, large sums of money, sometimes donated by one person, sometimes openly, sometimes secretly, all legal since the Supreme Court decision, Citizens United. How big of a role is money playing in the outcome of the Republican primary?
Money is at once the most overrated and underrated element in elections. If you take out the $50 million Romney gave himself in 2008, there's actually been more money spent in 2008 thus far than there has been in 2012. So this whole super PAC thing is totally overblown. It's inflated by people who don't like free speech very much and therefore want to shut it down as much as possible and have the government control as much speech as possible. Money's important, but it's free speech, and I don't think it's having any undue influence any more or less in any other election year.
Sam Hussein, you're with VoterPact.org.
VotePact.
VotePact, that's what I mean.
That's right.
Clearly, Seton believes that money isn't having an undue influence, and yet you can see, say in the case of the South Carolina primary, that one casino owner could give Newt Gingrich millions, maybe more than $10 million in total, that allowed Gingrich to run attack ads. That skewed the election, did it not, in terms of the sudden prominence of Newt Gingrich?
I think that Newt Gingrich's campaign is on life support fundamentally by one person, Adelson. He showed that again in the debate last night by his attacks on, not just attacks, warmongering on Iran, which other candidates deal with. And that a lot of what Gingrich said is for an audience of one, and that is the person who's backing his campaign more than any other. Now, does money determine elections? Maybe, maybe not. Ron Paul is able to maintain an election without huge donations from a few individuals. He's got much more of a broad base
but a
lot of money. There have been other candidates that have been totally, sidetracked, that have been ditched from the process, and have even said that they've been ditched by the process because they haven't been able to raise money. Now, is it a determinant? Maybe, maybe not. But it's definitely a factor, and maybe it's a magnified factor in terms of how the media cover it, because the media somehow bestow a candidate as being credible because they have money. So it becomes, in effect, the first primary, who gets covered on the first round before any votes are cast.
Michael Fauntroy, go ahead, jump in.
Well, I just wanted to add, there's a big difference between 2012 and 2008 to this point, and that is the proliferation of candidate forums and debates. That has given a number of candidates free money, essentially, to be on television, national TV, and they get 2 or 3 days worth of bumps out of it because there's the forum, then there's the coverage of the forum the next day, and if they said anything that was crazy or controversial, that coverage may last. That coverage may go into a third day. So yes, there may be less money spent, but that doesn't mean that the candidates aren't being able to benefit from an indirect value that comes from all of these different debates. We have had 20-some-odd debates. But if a candidate had to spend that kind of money to get that kind of exposure.
That's not what we're talking about.
We're talking about the extent to which money is spent. Money can be spent directly or indirectly, either by the candidate or by news media in terms of how they cover these candidates. And the point that I'm simply making is we should not simply look just at how much money is being spent to talk about the overall cost of a campaign or overall cost of an election cycle. There are a variety of other things that are involved in that we need to consider as well.
Go ahead, Eugene.
Well, let me just say fundamentally, I think making the comparison between 2008 and 2012 is a little bit of a false analogy, particularly considering that American Crossroads and Crossroads GPS, which are raising the most money of all the super PACs, have yet to really spend any money and are clearly keeping their powder dry for the general election, but have said they wanted to spend $300 million. But I do want to say about the Citizens United.
Unions spend $400 million.
Well, that's the issue about Citizens United. Well, let's talk about that.
No, unions could spend that money before Citizens United.
Well, here's the thing: is that unions
will allow us to spend as much money as unions.
That's not true. The reality is that unions cannot use union dues. They can only use contributions. So, in fact, Citizens United allows corporations and very rich people to raise more money than they will to influence the elections, more than unions will ever be able to do.
40% of teachers
listen, SEIU isn't going to be able to raise as much money from janitors as Sheldon Adelson and Freeze and all these other people. Phil Anschutz can pull out of their back pocket. But the point I want to make, though, I do think is that since there's no doubt about it that on the Democratic side,
$7 billion on left stuff since 1979.
Hey,
$7 billion.
There's no doubt.
I just want to let Eugene make the point that he's trying to make.
Well, the point that I want to make is that Citizens United, what it does, I don't think that it has such an outsized influence that's so different. I mean, since 1974, our modern campaign system, the whole thing is how do we get big money out of politics, and there's a new law every 5 years because they can't get big money out of politics. What it does do, I think, is change the profile to where individuals, whether it be George Soros, whether it be Sheldon Adelson, have more power to shape an election individually by using their own money than having to bundle or do whatever they had to do.
Well, let's just pick up on that. Okay, the Citizens United said you can give individuals can give unlimited speech, and that it has a certain, it can be anonymous through the super PACs. But what about money in general? I mean, to become president of the United States, you have to raise $1 billion. Each side will have to do that. I mean, where do the common people, the people who are working people, the people who don't have access to the banks, the corporations, or the military-industrial complex, how do they stand a chance? And how many of them are represented in either the House,
There's so much
Senate,
wrong
or
with the
White
context
House?
of this conversation. First of all, money doesn't chase. Ideas don't chase money. Money chases ideas. You think Newt Gingrich was anti-Israel until
wait a
Adelson
second.
gave him money?
Do you think, Seton? Do you think that there's anything
absurd.
peculiar? Do you think there's anything peculiar about the United States electoral system that allows greater preponderance of influence from money?
We spend more money per year on advertising mandates.
What about
than we do on
compared to
elections.
Europe? What about compared to the governments in the Middle East? So the United States is lecturing the whole world about democracy. What's the difference?
No, we're not lecturing about democracy. We're a republic, not a democracy, first of all. Second of all,
That doesn't stop us from lecturing.
Well, we have a lot to offer that a lot of countries could learn
what I'm
from.
asking you is compare the role of money in the United States electoral system, say to
money
Europe.
Money is speech.
That's actually not 100% true. I mean, the Citizens United case, which was based on Buckley v. Vallejo, actually did not rule that money is blanket speech. It ruled in certain cases money can be
money is in groceries, but try leaving the grocery store with some groceries without money.
Well, Sam, go ahead, jump in if you would.
Well, I mean, if speech is free, then shouldn't money be free by that logic?
No, free means free from government restriction, not from cost.
Right. Gingrich, going back to Gingrich, he. I think that
was he anti-Israel until Adelson came along?
Well, let him finish his point.
He was a tad more reasonable, actually. If you go back in the 1990s,
he's exactly reasonable now.
He's hemmed and hawed before. No, right now he is incredibly vociferous on the subject.
Well, he should be. Iran's about to get a nuclear bomb.
You sort of have to be a little silly not to see the connection between Adelson's
money chases ideas. It's not
fanaticness
the other way around. I was not a
issue.
liberal until someone cut me a check, and then all of a sudden I'm a conservative. This is an absurd argument. The good messengers of ideas that people like, the money finds them.
And what happens if there's no money behind a particular?
What happens if a billionaire?
So does the lack of money mean that the idea is wrong?
No, I'm not.
Does the lack of money mean that the idea is wrong?
Not necessarily.
I'm not talking about
it's a marketplace idea.
Is it your position that we don't have enough money? Do we not have enough money in the system?
And what happens to those ideas?
Well,
they go away.
There's all kinds of good ideas that
they get marginalized continuously.
Yes.
Right. And that's a bad gesture.
So then money doesn't chase good ideas in a neutral fashion. In a neutral fashion.
No, I said money chases ideas.
Herein lies the problem.
A lot of bad ideas with his money for a long time.
Herein lies the problem. 30 seconds after we started, we argued at each other about money. There's no question that money is a significant player in our political process. You seem to be suggesting that it's not a big deal and that we could actually use more money and not less. But the reality is, just yesterday, Buddy Roemer dropped out of the Republican race.
Thank goodness.
By
the way, he was the first person to qualify for
matching
funds.
He's an illegitimate candidate, but because he couldn't raise the money to compete. And it just seems to me that when you put such a high dollar figure as an entry fee, then you sort of box out potentially good candidates from getting in
No,
the idea.
it's the marketplace of ideas.
I'm almost finished. Who box out potentially good candidates who can grow over time, become more legitimized as a candidate, can shape and reshape ideas that could potentially be attractive to people in a general election.
Wait a minute.
But unfortunately, those people never get the chance. We spend our time, as you were saying earlier, covering the spending horse race. Who's raising the most money? And we attach a legitimacy to a candidate based not on their ideas, but based on how much money they can spend. To me, that's a significant problem because I find it very difficult to imagine that if Tim Pawlenty was still in the race, that, or rather, if he could raise the money, he wouldn't still be in the race. He had some ideas that made some sense to some people, and I just do not believe that it's good for our democracy, good for our public policy process, good for our overall society to have just a handful of people, the plutocrats of our country, deciding who it is that's legitimate in terms of who can be a candidate.
Governor Perry had a ton of money. How'd he do? He had a ton of money. How'd he do?
Well, if money, obviously...
Bill Gates went broke twice. Was his idea bad? Then the third time did pretty well because he had a good idea. These things don't always work out 100% of the time. Well, but he had a good marketing idea.
Well, I think the point is that
he marketed the product better than Apple did.
Well, I think
the fact of the matter is people go broke with good ideas all the time. Bad ideas get tons of money.
Right. Well, the point I'm making is that, listen, money obviously may not be the only issue, but if it wasn't probably the most central issue, you wouldn't see every candidate competing to raise the most money in every single major national election. Is it once the most influential and least influential item?
Well, one of the things that came up, of course, is the influence of money after the Supreme Court decision, Citizens United. But Eugene made the point that it wasn't a recent event or a recent court decision that propelled money to be a dominating factor. It doesn't mean those who have the most money always win, but unless you have a lot of money, you can't compete. Now, in a corporate America, they see, at the time of the general election, the Republican and the Democrat as sort of an investment. Right. And if you look at the Republican and Democratic candidates, where they get their top donations from at the time, they're AT&T, General Motors.
Okay, well, let's analyze
all those same corporations. So isn't it really the corporation saying these really are our candidates?
Well, here's
Republican
90% of contributions to campaigns are one of three things. The least innocuous is, if I give you money for your stupid campaign, will you leave me alone with your stupid laws when you get elected? The second one is, if I give you money, will you hamstring my competitor with regulations and not hamstring me? And then the most innocuous is Solyndra, which is, if I give you campaign money, will you write me a government check when you get in office? The solution to this is to reduce the size, scope, and sphere of influence of government so they don't have the regulatory hammer big enough or the checkbook big enough to warrant these kinds of contributions. If the government were within the constitutional constraints set for it, dramatically smaller, dramatically less in everyday life, dramatically over-regulating everything, dramatically overtaxing everything, 90% of these contributions would go away because they wouldn't be necessary.
Well, I actually don't agree with that at all. I mean, if you see the conservative argument about rebating things back to the states based on the 10th Amendment, what we see is that whether it's the Republican Governors Association, the ALEC, a significant number of right-wing organizations are doing everything possible to put more money into state-level elections. So whether it disappears from the national level or not, big money in politics and influencing the political decisions that are going on in the states would be the exact same.
We're talking about the 2012
in essence, though, would be the exact
race.
Same thing. In essence, what you're saying would be the exact same influence of money inside of the political system, whether it's at the federal level or the state level.
Well, excuse me, but we're talking about the presidential election, and this would all go away. Look, we have a $4 trillion budget because of this moronic administration, increasing spending by 34% in 5 years. Now, if that government wasn't so friggin' huge, none of these companies would be worried about keeping them off their backs or getting special favors.
They'd just be worried about keeping the governors and the state legislatures off their backs. So in essence, it would be the exact same process.
I want a free market. I don't want a hindered market by all these dumb government laws.
I want to ask everyone the same question about, at the time of the general election, the corporations, you can go down the list, because you'll see them all at the presidential inaugural.
They're hedging their bets, giving money to both sides. And that's not because they like one set of ideas over the other. That's because they understand that they're going to have to do business with whomever it is that wins. And one of the best ways to grease the skids to make their case is by giving money to both sides.
Which again, if they didn't have a regulatory hammer to beat them with, it wouldn't happen.
It's just a continued sort of perversion of the system where ideas are less important and access and money is more
Why
important.
is free speech perversion, but the gross oversize of government isn't a perversion?
Well, we're going to talk about the size of government, big or small, in a few minutes. But what I want to focus in again is the connection between corporations, or in the case of the banks of Wall Street, their relationship to the general election candidates. Now, around the country, there's been a lot of agitation against Wall Street, against the banks, a lot of opposition from the right and the left against the troubled asset relief program that was $600 billion plus. $7 trillion when you include loan guarantees and other kinds of assistance given to the banks.
Are you talking about the one that started under President Bush?
The one that started under President Bush and then was continued
exponentially greater by Obama.
But continued under the Democrats. In other words, here were the biggest banks. They were bailed out. Now, who in the general election in 2012 will get the bulk of Wall Street money, or will it be equally divided between the Republicans and Democrats, as it was to some extent in 2008, although President Obama seemed to get the greater part of that?
I really think we need to fine-tune our terms. I think that the issue that you just raised is a central one, but I would say establishment Democrats and establishment Republicans, because I think within each party there's a schism, and a very real schism. I would argue that, on the Wall Street bailouts, on the wars, on civil liberties, and so on, you have substantial agreement between the Obama administration and most of the Republican establishment. And I think that flows from the money that they get from Wall Street, money that they get from military contractors, and so on. Within the Republican Party, you have individuals like Ron Paul, like Gary Johnson, and others, who I think have broken on substantial part with some of those issues. And within the Democratic Party, you have people like Dennis Kucinich, and Cynthia McKinney is now outside the Democratic Party, but she was inside the Democratic Party, have also broken and disagree on those same central issues. And I'm talking about substantial issues. Virtually the entirety of our foreign policy, military bases around the world, war making, civil liberties, corporate trade deals, the drug war, civil liberties at home generally, the corporate power generally, the place of Wall Street generally. These are substantial issues where you, in effect, have the potential of an alliance between, or at least a programmatic alliance, between somebody like Ron Paul and somebody like Cynthia McKinney or Dennis Kucinich. Now, Ron Paul is out there, and Ron Paul did not back the Republican candidate last time around. He ran for the Republican nomination, and then he ended up having a press conference at the press club where he said, these are my 4 principles, well, basically what I just said, with the Federal Reserve also taking a prominent role, of course. And I think that anybody who backs these principles, I would urge people to vote for them. And you had the Constitution Party there, Cynthia McKinney was a Green Party representative, and so on.
Well, I think he's going to be reined in a large degree because his son's now a Republican
That
senator.
could well be. But the underlying principle, I think, is still there. The underlying issues are still there.
I want to write an op-ed called The Proper Care and Feeding of Paulites to try to get them to come vote for the Republican nominee.
Michael,
why would
let
you
me
do
ask
that?
you if what Sam is saying is true, and I think most people were somewhat nodding that there's a schism between establishment Republicans and some rank-and-file Republicans, establishment Democrats, and likewise rank-and-file Democrats. Why is there, and I want to ask you specifically about, again, the role of money here, why doesn't that rarely manifest into a serious third-party challenge, especially given all the discontent with establishment candidates from the Republicans and the Democrats? What holds it back, and what's the role of money there?
I agree that there is a schism. The difference is, in the Democratic Party and in the Republican Party, the establishment wings may well be 85 to 90% of those members in Congress. And those who are sort of outside the establishment and are so more independent thinking is a much smaller proportion of those overall members.
On the right side.
And so for that reason, I think you don't see the sort of alliances manifest themselves in terms of policy changes or serious challenges to the status quo.
Do you not see that the Tea Party elected 63 freshman Republican House members last year? That's not a minority percentage.
I will be curious to see how many of them are reelected this go round.
A bunch.
And we'll see. I'm pretty sure it won't be the 63.
Groups.
I'm sure you work with them. I don't dispute that. I'm just saying that many of them will not be reelected. And there's one thing to get a wave. There's another thing to sustain a wave. So I think that, so part of that is that the non-establishment parts are pretty small. And in terms of third party, and this gets back to—
In terms of Congress.
Yes, in terms of Congress.
But not necessarily the electorate.
Well, yes, I agree, but we were talking first about Congress. Now, in terms of a third party, we have a fundamental structural problem that works against the creation and maintenance of third parties. To me, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party are cartels that divide up the pie in states all across the country and make rules that are, in terms of party creation and voter registration and voter participation, are essentially about maintaining their own position in the status quo. So ultimately, if we're going to get changes that will be more open and more accessible to alternative ideas and alternative parties, we're going to have to deal with some of these state level laws that, in my opinion, make it very difficult for third parties to be.
Well, I think it's the ballot access laws for sure, which are different in every single state. They're really completely arbitrary. They're determined by a number of different factors. But the fact of the matter is, it's extremely onerous to be able to get on in any number of states, including, interestingly enough, the most prominent states, New York, California, where you have to be able to gather hundreds, 350, 400, 500,000. I think it's 350,000 that you need in California, 50,000 in New York. So if you don't have the resources to pay paid petitioners, it's almost impossible to get on the ballot in more than about a dozen, 15 states without not being able to campaign because you spend all your time getting on the ballot. And one thing we see quite often is we see the big Republican debates, but all around the country, small groups, churches, community groups of all types have campaign forums that they invite people to come to. They invite us to come to and speak. And people are hungry to hear different ideas, to see a socialist, to see a Republican, to see a Democrat, all on the stage together debating their ideas and talking. But because of ballot access, that's all we can really do in so many of these states, and we don't have a chance to give those people an opportunity to vote for these ideas that they're hearing, or at least a full range of them. So I think ballot access laws, without a doubt, are the biggest hurdle to third-party participation.
And the Democrats and the Republicans love it this way. They love it this way.
Well, I also think one of the big hurdles to a third party is most ideas have two sides, and they're divided up between the two parties. Now, what doesn't happen with you, and then this is what I agree with, is that if both parties are representing one side of the issue, then you get this problem. We saw that with illegal immigration in 2007, when you had the Republican president wanted amnesty, the Senate wanted amnesty, and the House wanted amnesty, and the people rose up. To me, that was the test drive for the Tea Party, was the people rose up and said, no, we're not going to have amnesty again. So I agree with you. And there's examples in Europe where the Le Pen party, no one was talking about immigration, so a third party rose up based almost exclusively on that single issue. But I think in general, and I think you saw this, and it was heartening to me because I don't like third parties, was the Tea Party fighting to take over the Republican Party, the conservatives take over the existing party, rather than try to start from scratch with a third.
I think that the biggest obstacle, though, something that you said earlier, Obama's got to go.
Oh, yeah.
You think Obama's got to go, and a lot of other people think that way. And people, I mean, you don't necessarily agree with somebody like Ron Paul, but there are a lot of people in the Republican Party who do, and there are people who feel like they got to vote for Obama because I don't want the Republican. And I think that that's largely the biggest advertisement for each one. The biggest advertisement for the Democratic Party is the Republican Party. And the biggest advertisement for the Republican Party is the Democratic Party.
In the United States, we have in the United States a system of winner take all, so that if your party, the party you're closer to, the Democratic Party, doesn't win, then the party you really don't want, the Republican Party, will win. So you have situations like, say, in the 1988 elections where Jesse Jackson ran for a second time. He had a considerable support within the Democratic primary for the first time from white working class voters in addition to black voters. And a lot of people wanted Jesse Jackson to become a third party, a progressive third party that would sort of be anti-establishment. At the end, he folded in and threw his weight behind the Democratic Party candidate at that time. A lot of people were disappointed, but
paid a lot of dividends.
But the fact of the matter is, well, in addition to the fact that it didn't work out for the Democratic candidate, the thing is that there's
the system going.
There's no voice, though, for the Jackson voters under that situation. Like we're in a parliamentary electoral system, Jesse Jackson would have 20% of the votes and 20% of the people in parliament.
Perot got 19%.
A billionaire.
Well, that speaks to an additional problem I see, and that is any third party would likely injure one of the two existing parties.
Each issue.
So what you really need is a second party to emerge out of the Republican Party and a second party to emerge out of the Democratic Party, in which you really have four parties: a progressive party, a Democratic Party, a conservative party or a libertarian party, and a Republican Party. And then neither party is significantly injured, and then you can have a fight about ideas. We can't have that right now.
Well, I don't know why you can't have a fight about ideas right now. I mean, I think it's important to have a fight of ideas about anything. I think really the reality is you can't have a true democratic political system if people don't stand up for what they believe in.
Have we not been debating Obamacare? Have we been not debating bailouts?
We're not having an argument about ideas.
Sure we
We're
are.
having an argument about people. We got to get rid of Obama. Oh no, we got to keep him.
But why do we have to get rid of Obama?
The issue is about personalities. It's not about issues, and that's the biggest problem.
Of course it is. Why do we have to get rid of Obama? Because we don't want any more bailouts. We don't want any more crony socialism.
But Bush was for the bailouts. Romney was for the bailouts.
Which is why we didn't like him.
So come on. But that's not a choice.
All of our kids. Wait a minute. Is there a
Republicans used to argue for the individual mandate in health care.
Right.
Okay. And so now President Obama literally co-opts the issue, runs with it, and now all of a sudden Republicans don't like it.
No.
That's not about issues. That's about individuals.
Eugene,
No, it's not.
Let me ask you. You're an independent. You're from the left. President Obama could have, when he had the control of the House, the control of the Senate, big majorities, and very popular. When he wanted to reform health care, he could have said, we're going to go for a single-payer health plan.
Did.
That would have done in the insurance companies, but it would have been very popular. According to the polls, the American people had 70% of the support. Why did President Obama not do what his base wanted him to do? In 20 seconds, because we're going to go to break.
In 20 seconds, I mean, he dropped the public option in order to win over the insurance industry to a certain degree, the hospital industry, because obviously his key point was just to get something passed so he could put it on an election agenda in 2012, not to actually bring a progressive agenda. Well, it was so unpopular. That's why 70% of people supported a public option.
Which is why we had 63 freshman House members, because to undo and stop what Obama was doing.
Exactly, because he didn't create a public option.
That's
so I don't
not why
think
the
you can
Tea
say
Party
that the
rose
Tea
up.
Party was able to
The Tea Party was
get rid
not
of the
upset
public
because there was no
option
public option.
We're going to continue the discussion, but we're going to focus on foreign policy when we come right back after a short break. We'll see you in a moment. Welcome back to the second segment of 2.5 Hours. We're joined in our Washington, D.C. studio by four guests discussing the 2012 elections. The first segment, we talked about money, the role of money in the elections. We're going to talk about foreign policy and where the Republicans, Democrats, and independent candidates stand. We're joined by Seton Motley, president of Less Government. Sam Hussein, votepact.org. Michael Fauntroy, he's a professor at George Mason University. Eugene Puryear, Party for Socialism and Liberation. We were discussing the role of money in the first half. I want to go to foreign policy, and we're going to go this way this time instead of this way. When President Obama came into office in January 2009, millions of people were in the mall. It was a period of great excitement. I would say euphoria that not only was President Bush leaving, but the Bush era was going, and people thought there would be a big change not only in domestic but also in foreign policy. And yet President Obama continued at that time the occupation of Iraq. He tripled the number of troops in Afghanistan. He told Israel to stop building West Bank settlements, but they built more, and it didn't lead to a break in or even a major change in U.S. policy towards Israel. Why the similarity to the Bush foreign policy, if it was, in fact, that, Eugene?
Well, we talk about the establishment in both parties, and I think that's the real reason when you look at it. I mean, certainly there's a consensus among those who I think, well, maybe we don't agree on this, but at least those who have sort of a hammerlock on politics with the money and the power. I think there's a general consensus about what national security strategy should be and what it means to, quote unquote, to protect the United States. And I want to say one thing, though, is I don't think people should present it as like a bait and switch by Obama. I mean, if you remember in the 2008 campaign, he made the big point of making the speech, we're going to crush al-Qaeda, we're going to continue a lot of these policies, although though on civil liberties, of course,
Close Guantanamo.
First
executive order, close
right,
Guantanamo.
but I mean, he also maintained the state security doctrine in terms of assassinations abroad and other things like that, and in many cases has expanded what the Bush administration has attempted to do. If you look at the Jones case that was just struck down by the Supreme Court, that was right here in the District of Columbia, it was the Obama administration lawyers who were trying to maintain that the police have the right to put a GPS on your car and track you anywhere, which was a significant, without a warrant, that is, which was a significant step forward in a break in civil liberties. So I think there was no change because Obama was representing that same sort of establishment consensus.
That was more than what Bush was doing.
Well, it was sort of
that was a lot more than what Bush was doing.
But it's the same intellectual justification for it. Oh, with the exact same, the state security doctrine that we can go around the world, we can kill whoever we want, and we don't have to tell anyone because it's a secret.
No. This is a significant step forward because that was on people's citizens
and this is Bush who wanted to do tips, who wanted to turn your mail carrier into a spy on you. So I don't think you can say that Obama is worse than Bush, but I do think you can say that he has been at least as aggressive as Bush in eliminating our civil liberties.
Against citizens.
Michael, I want to ask you the same question. Do you see it as a continuity of the Bush policy, but perhaps in a more pronounced way, a pullback? How do you see it in terms of foreign policy?
Well, I think there's a big difference between domestic policy and foreign policy. In domestic policy, when you switch from one party to the other controlling the White House, you're more likely to see significant policy changes. I see foreign policy very differently, and often foreign policy is about continuity. Being able to maintain good relationships with the allies and box in and sort of be able to manage your enemies, either perceived or real. And so what the president is doing, to my way of thinking, is just a continuation of what most presidents do, and that is maintain America's position in the world and do whatever it takes to get that done. I do not see President Obama blazing any particular trails in terms of foreign policy. And I should also note that his foreign policy positions have domestic impacts in terms of how voters see him. And so I think there's some constraints that he has to face and has to deal with as he moves along in those areas.
Sam, I want to ask you, because you have a very particular position. You're at the press club. You were the center of a controversy recently when you dared challenge by asking a tough question a Saudi diplomat. And at first, the press club suspended your membership in the press club because you were challenging the Saudi diplomat, and then you were victorious and reinstated after a lot of protest about it. But take Saudi Arabia. Here, the Bush administration, and before it, earlier Republican and Democratic administrations gave 100% support for the Saudi monarchy. Matter of fact, Ronald Reagan said there will be no revolution in Saudi Arabia, as if that's up to the American president, when he was president in 1980. What accounts say in the case of the oil-rich Persian Arabian Gulf region or Saudi Arabia for the continuity in U.S. policy? Is that money? Is that corporate influence? Is that a global foreign policy?
I think it's a global foreign policy that's informed by corporate interests, both in the oil sector and in the military sector, that keeps that alliance going, that they end up being, in effect, proxies and allies, and that there's a hemming and a hawing about it. And I'm sure that there's squabbles within the family, so to speak, and it literally is a family at times when you have, Bandar Bush and figures like this, in effect, managing it. And I think it belies any notion. I mean, the United States, I think you were saying, you're right, the United States has a lot of good things to share with the rest of the world. Personal freedom in the United States is remarkable. You have a left-right alliance against a voter ID card, for example.
How would this show go in Tehran?
Something. Well, you have restrictions. Syria is obviously an oppressive regime, but you had health care, people had housing, and so on. I've been to Syria, and you don't have a deranged corporatized culture. You have a police state instead. Pick and choose. Iran, some of the same choices. Saudi Arabia is off the map in that it's authoritarian and commercialized, and is the closest U.S. ally, with the possible exception of Israel, which exercises perhaps the one form of government that's more oppressive than Saudi Arabia, and that's long-term military occupation for generations.
Well, there's a reason that happened because they got attacked from the flank seven times.
That is potentially the one thing that is more oppressive.
That's a joke. That's just a joke.
So I think that we should be looking at U.S. democracy, and we should be picking and choosing from around the world.
I'm trying to get at the.
What can we learn? And what can we share?
Outside of aspirational sort of sentiments about what could be done differently, we can look at the actual history, say in the post-World War II period, where Republican, Democrat, whoever is in office, there are certain things that are continuous. Support for the Saudi monarchy. That's an undiluted support. It's uncritical. You asked the Saudi diplomat a hard question, and you got suspended from the National Press Club. I mean, that showed that a power in Washington was listening to an ally. What makes Saudi Arabia the least democratic entity going in the Middle East such a strong ally, Seton? Why is it? Why is it Israel and Saudi Arabia are the two linchpins of U.S. policy there?
Look, his Israel assertion is just absurd. It's patently absurd.
I'm asking you, what's the basis for the support for Israel and Saudi Arabia in such an undiluted
fashion? Well, I think
fashion?
Throughout the Muslim world, and I was actually writing a book called The Average White Guy's Guide to Islam with a Muslim friend of mine. Several years ago, we had to stop because of a job I got. But anyway, the point being, I kind of refer to the Middle East as a Cold War Etch-a-Sketch. We kind of picked and chose sides vis-a-vis the Soviet Union, and we've been under that paradigm for 50, 60 years. And now, I said, it's like the Etch-a-Sketch. The Cold War's over, we got to shake up the Etch-a-Sketch. And that's what we're seeing, I think, now.
We are?
Yeah.
What are we seeing that's different? Because the U.S. has now, with the Arab Spring, broken with the Saudis? Come on.
No,
Come on.
No, I'm not talking
We're
about...
not seeing that now. That's exactly the point. That we're not seeing
the overthrow of Hosni Mubarak, the overthrow of Muammar Gaddafi. That's the Etch-a-Sketch that's being
United States of America.
Well, I was opposed to both throwing out Mubarak and
It's very forthright of you to admit that.
No,
it's very forthright of you to admit that you don't want democracy in Egypt.
I don't want Islamists running the show.
You don't want democracy in Egypt.
And
you seem to not want it in Saudi Arabia either. And you seem to not want it for the Palestinians either.
Palestinians didn't exist prior to 1967.
Oh.
They were
Are you getting any money from Adelson?
They were
because you should be.
Jordanians, Egyptians, and Syrians. But as far as Obama's foreign policy is concerned, he's actually flipped it on its head. If you're an ally of the U.S., he throws you under the bus.
Saudi
Mubarak,
Arabia.
Gaddafi.
I'm talking about
because he's ditched the Saudis. Because he's ditched the Israelis.
Iran. With the Green Revolution.
They got rid of Gaddafi and they're getting rid of Assad, or at least they got him on the run. That's exactly the opposite of what you're saying.
It's
exactly the opposite of what you're saying.
Mubarak was an ally. Obama threw him under the bus.
He didn't throw him out under the bus. He had no choice.
Well, yeah, he didn't throw him under the bus. Mubarak was overthrown. I mean, he had no choice. I mean, Obama waited to the last possible second to come out and support the Arab Spring.
Obama ran down the street chasing the bus to get a seat on the bus. That was something that rose up from the people.
What I'm saying is, he was an ally of the United States. He got and Obama didn't help him. Iran, who was the penultimate Islamist terror in the world,
I just have to wait a second.
The Green Revolution.
Seton, and I'd like to ask you all of this. I mean, President Obama at the last moment said Mubarak must go after it was clear he could not stay because of the people's uprising. But at no time did the United States government cease giving aid to the Mubarak government and to the military. Why is that? In other words, why? Like the U.S. says, the issue is democracy or lack of democracy, but that was clearly a dictatorship.
To my way of thinking, it's never really been about democracy or not. They say they want democracy, but what they really want is stability and predictability there. The United States government, over the years, without regard to Democrats or Republicans, have made unholy alliances with countries all over the globe, undemocratic, misogynistic, terroristic in some respects, authoritarian, because they could predict what they would be able to do with those countries. And I just think that that's really what the administration wants, stability and continuity.
I don't know that that's necessarily the case, because they don't necessarily want stability. Invading Iraq was not a stable thing to do. Allowing Israel to bomb southern Lebanon, bomb Gaza, not a stabilizing thing to do. So I think that it might seem that way at times.
I think there are exceptions, but writ large, if you look at what's going on in Africa,
there are other
and
interests
other parts of the world
at play that you sometimes want instability. You don't want a strong Iraq that has, or a strong Iran that can play an independent role. on the world stage. You don't want a strong Egypt
By
that can play
independent role,
an
do you mean bomb Tel Aviv? Is that the independent role you're talking
that
about?
can develop an industrial base. That can
that can do
provide
something that
for
the
its
American
people.
doesn't like. I mean, you can make a joke about bombing Tel Aviv, but the point of the matter is that the United States says that anybody, well, let me just put it this way: the United States says that Israel can have nuclear weapons and it's totally okay
because they're not going to use them the way Ahmadinejad.
Well, I mean, it just seems interesting that they're allowed to make as many threats as they want, to bomb as many people. I mean, you've got Ehud Barak and the New York Times saying the reason why that what we're trying to do in Iran is make every Iranian scientist think who's going to knock on my window and put a bomb underneath my car. If that's not terrorism, I don't know what it is.
The nuclear scientist.
Yeah, okay, but nuclear science is a legitimate area of science, isn't it?
That's not what they're using it for.
I mean, Iran is entitled under the IAEA to have a civilian nuclear energy program. No one asserts that Iran has a nuclear bomb right now.
No,
do they? Okay.
but the leaders assert that they want one.
Now the question is, they assert the opposite.
The leaders assert that they want one,
which makes sense because the only countries the United States hasn't tried to attack are the ones that say they have nuclear weapons. So
that's not true.
The supreme leader, the supreme leader of Iran said even yesterday that possession of a nuclear weapon, an atomic weapon, is a, quote, sin. Now, you might not believe him, but that's what he just actually said. Now, the question is...
Versus the 100 other times he said he's going to wipe Israel off the map.
The U.S. I want to ask all of you this question. The U.S. possesses 10,000 nuclear warheads. It has 7,800 of them deployed. Is it really possible in the U.S. strategic thinking that Iran poses a nuclear menace, given the overwhelming nuclear power that the United States, and in the case of Israel, that they have hundreds of nuclear bombs? Is that a credible thing?
Yes.
And if it's not, why do the Democrats and Republicans assert it in a bipartisan
because
fashion?
it's not just about a bomb. Let me just say one sentence. It's not just about a bomb. It's about these morons getting nuclear fission material, and then a suitcase bomb appears in New York City all of a sudden. It's not just launching a rocket with a nuclear warhead at Tel Aviv. It's them having that kind of material to then spread around the globe. They obviously want to do it.
So if Iran has a capability for a nuclear weapon, then they should be attacked.
Well, let
or
me put it to you
sanctioned.
like this. You can make a dirty bomb with things that you can get anywhere, like X-ray machines at dentist and doctor's office. So should we ban GE from selling X-ray machines because people can steal it from a dentist's office and make it into
10,000 years for...
Well, Iran only has 12% enriched uranium, which, you know what I'm saying, not 90%, which they did have in there. I mean, it's important to note that in the research reactor in Tehran, whatever you want to call it, they had 90% enriched uranium given to them by the United States and the Atoms for Peace program. And during that entire time, all that fuel is gone, they never used it to make a nuclear weapon. So all of a sudden, they want us to believe that because Iran is close to getting 20% enriched uranium, which is technically the weapons threshold, that they are going to all of a sudden build a bomb and blow it up.
The leadership of Iran who says they want to do it and they're going to do it.
Because we have limited time, we're going to move to other parts of U.S. Foreign policy. The United States maintains perhaps 700 to 900 military installations all over the world. Now, the last time before the September 11th attacks that the U.S. mainland was attacked was in the War of 1812. The question is, the Democrats and Republicans in Congress almost unanimously vote for every year's annual military budget and the maintenance of this kind of global network of military installations. Why? Why is it a bipartisan agreement? Why is that the Republicans and Democrats so much the same on that issue?
I'm for pulling the plug on a lot of those. Why the heck?
I'm asking you why the Democrats and Republicans don't.
I think there's a lot of checkbook inertia in Washington, where they just sign off plus 5% every year.
Like for profits, for money. In other words, it's an incentive.
Well, there's all kinds of factors involved, but I think a lot of it is just we spend a ton of money, and we're going to spend a ton of money plus 5% each new year, and there's no real thought. That's one of the reasons conservatives push for baseline budgeting, is because you actually have to analyze the budgets each year and go, okay, what are we doing with this automatic? Let's just renew plus 5%.
Is that what it is, Sam? Is it checkbook inertia? In other words, let's just keep doing what we did the year before and the year before and the year before, or is there something else to it?
I think there's something else to it because you see a corrosion of so-called entitlements, for example, because there's a financial interest in getting rid of them.
Where do you see a corrosion of entitlements? They've exploded in size.
Are you familiar with Mr. Peterson, who's trying to privatize Social Security?
Is it happening?
Are you familiar with the corrosion? Are you familiar with the end of welfare?
I'd love to.
Did you hear that happened in the 1990s?
It never happened.
You didn't hear that?
It never happened
in the 1990s. Okay.
Do we still have welfare?
No, we don't. We have
Of course we do.
TANF. We have TANF, which is a shriveled
We have
stepchild.
47 million people on food stamps.
You're simply misinformed.
We don't have 47 million
We
people
don't
on
have
food stamps?
welfare like we had 20 years ago.
Well, we shouldn't.
Well,
It was
let's
a
go back.
slogan.
So now you agree.
No, but we didn't end
Go back
welfare.
to
You
the
said we
basics
ended
now.
welfare. You're wrong.
No,
You're fundamentally incorrect.
The welfare issue is an interesting one, but that's not my question. It's about the military budget and the military bases and the role of the two
Well,
parties.
it's a variation of Eisenhower's edict about the military-industrial complex, of course, except that it is global, that it isn't just simply bringing home the bacon to a military base in different congressional districts, that it is global. So I think ultimately, corporations and money and so on plays a role, but ultimately it's an ideological manifestation of what the United States sees itself as, and it sees itself as an empire. Benevolent, perhaps. Perhaps it can be attempted to be justified that what would the alternative be? Because if we weren't the global hegemon, then you would have China and Japan and France and Germany. Everybody would be at each other's throats, and there would be global chaos. Maybe that's the underlying, I think, false intellectual justification for it, but ultimately is a conception of what the United States sees itself as, and that is a global hegemon.
We're in a situation, Michael, where tens of millions of people are either unemployed or underemployed. Millions have lost their homes or are threatened to lose their homes because of foreclosure. In other words, there is still a very deep, stubbornly deep economic crisis. And yet there's this huge amount of money that goes every year to the military budget. Is it, as General Eisenhower said in his farewell address, the creation of a military-industrial complex? Does that dominate the two parties?
Well, I don't think there's any question about that, and it does so for economic and for political reasons. Economically, that drives a lot of development in communities around military bases in the United States, for people who supply the military with munitions and other items. And then politically, no one wants to be charged with being, soft on terrorism or against the American military. So to both of these points at some level, members of Congress just sign off on it in part because they don't want to have that be an issue against them in the upcoming election. So from my perspective, I see this as an attempt to engage in economic development around the world with direct and indirect benefits to Americans, and also to ward off any potential political problems going forward. It's pretty simple to me.
Yeah, well, I also think that there's an international aspect to that. I mean, if you look at President Obama's recent trip to Australia, where he announced the redeployment of the Marines, the statement made by the Australian political figures there, I believe it was the former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd, but I could be wrong on that, said, if you think that, if you don't think the American security cordon is important, wait till it's gone. I mean, I think the United States, and you look at, whether it's President Obama or the Republican candidates, all they talk about is how America has to be the #1 country and we need to do whatever it is to do that. And I think the reality is there's a number of other countries as well that expect the United States not just to defend its own interests, but to defend the general interest of those countries that are allied with it, the major industrialized powers in Europe and Japan and Australia and South Korea.
As I said, I'm for withdrawing a lot of these, but the fact of the matter is most of these countries invited us in to open military establishments.
Well, and some of them want us out, like Okinawa, we won't leave.
The elites of those countries.
But to Sam's point, there's also a preference to expand that. There's been a lot of talk about placing military bases in various African countries, which has created a lot of heartburn among some African nations and among people here, among people in the United States. And so there is a tremendous amount of interest in expanding the number of military bases around the country, notwithstanding the exorbitant costs, much of which is not seen by rank-and-file Americans.
Well, let's go to Africa, because we have AFRICOM now, which is oddly based in Berlin or Bonn. But the U.S., you can see, is expanding its military operations in both North Africa and West Africa. Eugene, you follow Africa. What do you make of that? And does that have bipartisan support?
Certainly. Well, I think it's also important to put in East Africa, which is really where AFRICOM, I think, has been the most active so far. But, I mean, what you clearly see here is an alliance between certain sections of African elites who, for a variety of reasons, are looking to be able to secure their territory and secure their writ and are using the U.S. government and the threat of so-called terrorism to bring in these AFRICOM trainers, money, guns, and so on and so forth. Okay. Well, I mean, I don't know if you could call the Tuareg people in Mali who have been struggling for self-determination for hundreds of years to be terrorists, but it's okay if the United States calls them, you know, Al-Qaeda affiliated or whatever and lumps them all in together. But the reality is that you have governments, you know, whether the transition federal government, which is a fake government, a propped up puppet government in Somalia that the United States gives guns and weapons to. Clearly what's going on here, and I think we spoke about stability, is certainly they're speaking towards the need to create stability, but what kind of stability? What they're looking to do is solidify certain governments and certain interests in a particular situation, and I think AFRICOM is really just sort of a furtherance of these policies in Africa.
Let's go also to something Seton raised in the beginning, which was about President Obama's declaration, his promise really to close Guantanamo was on executive order as one of his first acts. And here we are nearing the end of Obama's first term, and it's not getting close to being closed. In fact, there are military trials taking place. Obama clearly has given up on closing Guantanamo. Now, Guantanamo was recognized by the United Nations as a torture center. That's how the United Nations characterized it.
Intellectual torture
center. Why did President Obama not close Guantanamo, and what message does that send to the other parts of the world?
Because of all his inflated rhetoric and naivete in campaigning, that was one of the things. That was one of the most glittering examples of he had no idea what he was talking about when he ran for office and signed the executive order. You have to put these people. There's a reason it was chosen. The spot was chosen. The Bush administration thought about it. There's a reason it exists. There's a reason the military tribunals go on. And I think he was just completely in over his head when he was campaigning on that particular issue, especially. And when he actually got into office, he went, because remember, he didn't, it's not like he signed the executive order and then gave up. He tried. Remember, they tried to, Dick Durbin, the senator from Illinois, said, oh, it would be a great economic incentive to build prisons in Illinois for these people. And the Illinois people went, excuse me, what? It's untenable to do anything but, pretty much, but what we're doing in Guantanamo. And Obama was, you know, shooting from the hip, and he got into office, and then reality hit him.
Go ahead, Sam, and then I want to turn to Afghanistan and Pakistan after that.
Sure. Well, I mean, you know, when Obama came in, his cabinet was filled with, he picked his foreign policy team were all people who voted for the Iraq War. The thing that people thought that they were getting, to what proportion that was false advertising on his part, and what proportion it was delusion on the part of many people who voted for him, we can argue about. But you know, in terms of something like Guantanamo, he didn't close because he could get away with it because it's an incredible game of triangulation of, you know, because was initially cast as the peace candidate in many quarters because he made a speech, didn't vote, made a speech against the Iraq War, that somehow gives him incredible license to maintain the military industrial machinery and expand it in some ways in terms of assassination. In terms of, I mean, he's curtailing in some respects torture and so on. In some respects, not in toto by any means, but increasing assassinations. So is that supposed to be progress? Is that supposed to be progress? Exactly.
My joke was, I bet if he asked, Osama bin Laden would have preferred to be waterboarded.
And so I think that it speaks to the electoral bind that the American people are in. Where are you going to go? That's what Rahm Emanuel said. Where are you going to go? So of course his so-called base, his so-called electoral base, will support him in spite of not closing on time.
During the election campaign in 2008, President Obama, as Eugene mentioned and maybe others mentioned as well, never said that the war in Afghanistan was going to be wound down. In fact, he said the Iraq war had been the wrong war in the wrong place at the wrong time, and Afghanistan was the right war. And sure enough, when President Obama came in, there was a doubling and then a tripling of American military forces in Afghanistan. Now it's 100,000, 150,000 NATO contingent. And yet, there's no end no light at the end of this tunnel, and now the United States government appears to be helping the Taliban establish an office overseas for the purpose of negotiations. Do you see
in Qatar, I believe,
in Qatar
significantly?
Qatar, Taliban is there. They're there with the support of not just President Obama, but the Pentagon, obviously, because it wouldn't happen without the support of the Pentagon brass. Is there any significant difference between the Democrats and the Republicans on the issue of Afghanistan?
None that I see. It seems to me, again, this is more of an establishment issue. There is a general consensus among Republican and Democratic elites. Again, I think the push is one for stability. But to Eugene's point, what kind of stability are we talking about? They want something that's stable so they can claim victory. If bombs are still exploding all over the place and there's no real evidence that the American and NATO presence is making a difference, then it's difficult. It's more difficult for them to argue that they need to pull out now. But if they can create some sort of stability, even if it's a false stability or a short-term stability, I think they will seek to do that and claim victory and go home.
Okay, so let's talk about that, Eugene. Is the American war sort of going on and on and on in Afghanistan? It's now the longest war in U.S. history. A lot of American soldiers are being killed or wounded or traumatized. Many tens of thousands more Afghans are suffering. Is this really just continuing so that the elected officials or the officials in uniform don't have to take responsibility for what's a lost cause? In other words, hoping that have the war ended some way that it's not perceived as a defeat, as happened, say, during Vietnam?
Well, I think that's very important. And I mean, if you look at the run-up to Iraq, I mean, so much of that was trying to find a way to manage it to make it look good. I mean, I think beyond that, though, the whole reason they're in Afghanistan is for geostrategic purposes. And so if they were to leave without some sort of negotiated solution, they would actually have no, assurance that some sort of other force opposed to the United States could emerge as the Afghan government. And so I think that's fundamentally what this negotiation with the Taliban about is to achieve a certain sort of baseline stability, as you say, so that whatever governmental authority emerges is someone they can at least work with and that other allies in the region can work with.
We have 1 minute left. I just want to stay on Afghanistan. Now you see the large demonstrations are erupting over the burning of the Quran. This is not the first time that's happened. The idea of winning hearts and minds in Afghanistan seems to be off the radar if you're doing things that are inciting masses of people to rise up against you, not just Taliban. Sam Hussein, just give us the last word on that. Do you feel that the situation in Afghanistan is leading to some sort of kind of near rebellion in the country because of occupation or perceived insensitivity on religion?
I think it's not just simply the perceived insensitivity on religion, but the actual policy of drones, of attacks, of civilian deaths continued, and so on, and what kind of relationship one has. Does the United States set up a proxy government in the name of democracy that makes deals with local chieftains or warlords, or does it actually deliver something that more of the Afghan people can actually benefit from?
I'm going to give you the last word. Is it time or isn't it time for the U.S. to change its policy?
Surprise everybody.
To change its policy in the Middle East?
Oh, I think as far as specifically Afghanistan, we should have dumped the.
Not Afghanistan, the Middle East.
We should have left there 10 years ago, 8 years ago, whatever. Second of all, as far as the broader Middle East. In some ways, yes. In some ways, no. Which is a fantastic way to close the show. I know.
It's an odd way to close the show, but we're going to take that as possibly. Okay, we're going to come back next time. This is Brian Becker. We'll see you next episode. Thank you.